Welcome to this episode of Overlap. I'm Kris from the China Academy. Today I'm really happy, really thrilled to be joined by Belén de los Santos from teleSUR, which is an influential Latin American news network, to discuss how Trump is perceived in Latin America and China. Welcome. Let's just start from the general view. Do people like him or hate him?
So that's a complex question, right? We cannot think its relationship with the United States without thinking its history of the US imperialist ambitions and relations with the Latin American and Caribbean region. We would need to think back to the Monroe Doctrine and this idea of the US constantly perceiving Latin America and the Caribbean as its so-called backyard. This idea that it's an area to control, it's an area to discipline also. It's an area where no one else can come and play, so to speak. So that is definitely playing a part. And that has developed a long tradition and a long history of very anti-imperialist sentiments in many of the peoples, in many of these countries. We need to keep in mind that a lot of the people today in Latin America have had personal history, or their families still remember moments of direct intervention. Central America has a lot of history of direct invasions, the Panama example, for example, without even talking about the history of Cuba, the history of Venezuela. So we, of course, need to start thinking that there's a big anti-imperialist sentiment in the region that translate to a negative image of Trump. And most polls have pointed this out in the first presidency. But one thing that we need to keep in mind is that in the last few years, there's been some far-right sectors in this region that have taken to Trump as sort of like a role model. So we have like Milei in Argentina, and we had Bolsonaro in Brazil, and we have Bukele in El Salvador. They have looked up at Trump as a possible like role model leader, like this outcast figure that comes to disrupt the whole thing. And their followers also look up at this sort of leadership. So those two things, I think that would be a good point to start. Those two things are colliding, are contributing to this polarization that is seen across the world, but in Latin America, it takes like that shift.
Okay, you mentioned there are some far-right politicians in Brazil previously and Argentina right now. From what I see and what I read, that Trump also is closely aligned with someone like people like Steve Bannon, who claims to be a traditionalist, and also the mentor of the previous president of Brazil, who's also a self-claimed traditionalist, Olavo de Carvalho, who I believe you might know very well.
You were right on the spot there. This like sort of Trump followers, or these new leaders that imitate that idea, are also building on those sentiments that have their correlations in this region. So we need to keep in mind that, for example, from the first decade of the 21st century, we had a lot of progressive, like the progressive wave in Latin America, and also a very good economic period for the region. And that started to change economically. It started to change. And the real material lives of these people, in many cases, worsened, as they did worldwide. But in this region, this also became an anger sentiment in some sectors of society, which saw that these models, in some cases, either weren't working or weren't working as well, or you had a lot of external conditions. So these leaders, Bolsonaro in Brazil, as you were mentioning, later on Milei in Argentina, who's now the current president, they used that anger as well, just as Trump, and also imitating those logics that Trump was also driving from. And they had that same sentiment of, let's restore things like the way they were, like the way they were before cultural changes, before progressive movements. Many people have seen this as a sort of reactionary movement. And of course, it might be true that there's some aspects of that. Maybe we could get deeper and think that there are also like other parts to understand that sentiment, but definitely there's a fiber there that both Trump is using that to get a lot of support, and it's Latin American epilogues or the leaders that are following that lead are also using. And also, this is true for the Trump followers, the Latino Trump followers that made up a significant portion of his electoral win in 2024. So that Trump calling for those traditional values to come back and betting on that conservatism to and fueling that anger and presenting that tradition as a possible solution was very well received by a sector of the Latino population, specifically young men, very as well linked to these traditional aspects that connected very well with that. So you can see that in Latin America, but you also need to think about Latinos in the US because it's like one tradition.
Yes, you mentioned exactly last year the electoral win of Donald Trump was largely due to the swaying, the very great sway of Latino votes, especially the young men. I wonder how they might feel because Trump is actually going after them, the so-called illegal immigration in the U.S., cracking down hard on them. I wonder their support will go away, if anything. But this is a contradiction right there because Trump actually went into the White House based on two promises, and one of them is to secure border, and the other one is to end the forever war, right? So to secure a border, they have a very white nationalist understanding of the country. So it's a reimagining of U.S. I wonder, facing with this reality, what kind of political rhetoric they might come up with to persuade votes, and how will these people feel when they feel betrayed by those politicians who promised you, okay, we'll be good, okay, restore the traditional values, but in the end, you are not recognized as part of the population. I wonder how they feel. I wonder how they feel, and also the rest of Latin America who are not part of the U.S. population. If Trump deports those people to the respective countries of origin, would you be welcoming them back, or what kind of attitude do you have for those people?
You were talking, these are all like contradicting topics, and that's exactly right. Let's think about Trump campaigning in 2024. He was campaigning on closing the border, but he was also campaigning to obtain that Latino vote that was set to define the race. And that was happening at the same time. So definitely this is a contradiction from the beginning. Trump is hitting 6 months of his second term right now, and some of these sentiment polls are trying to evaluate how do these people feel right now. They voted for Trump, but now in many cases they are worried that they, even being US citizens, regular US citizens right now, even having been able to vote, they have fears of their families being broken apart or they themselves being arrested because you have a lot of irregular denunciations. Polls are picking up that even Latino population with papers, so to say, so registered as US citizens at the moment, even they are becoming afraid of being targeted by this anti-immigration policies, and of course the stigmatization and the discrimination that this is launching on the entire country. So definitely this is playing a role, and it's actually the question when we see all the major protests that are going on right now. The anti-immigration protests that started in LA, that are being called the No Kings protest, but extended to over 2,000 cities. So over 2,000 cities are having like wide demonstrations. They're like, experts are calculating this on 4 to 6 million people that protested on one single day. And these are primarily Latino led, at least in Los Angeles, which is one of the districts with the highest amount of Latino population. They're driving these mobilizations. And polls suggest that many of those, or some of those, should have or statistically must have voted for Trump. So that shift is happening at this moment. And it's really a matter of, as you were saying, like, how will that contradiction go? Like, where is that going in terms of the next elections? What will prevail? You were saying it before. The numbers and the data suggest that those people were voting Trump based on economic worries. They wanted lower inflation and they wanted secure jobs, and they weren't prioritizing as much the possibility of being targeted by anti-immigration politics, or in the most cases they didn't think they would be the targets. But now sometimes they are. So what will happen with that? What sentiment will prevail? That's like the big question.
Yeah, and I think talking about sentiments, because you mentioned, okay, people who are attracted by the stories of traditional household or patriarchy or whatever, those traditional values, and those white voters who are disillusioned with the way Western culture or American culture has been degenerated by the so-called cultural Marxism or so-called woke progressivism. Both sides really focus on abstract concepts, ideologies, and stories instead of real economic foundation of the society. And to be fair, I think America really need Latin American immigrants. If you look at the Bracero program of Mexico in the 50s or 40s, the Mexicans, they made up a bulk of the labor force of the American agricultural industry. And America really need those people working in America. And also, when you look at the way the global economy is structured, um, we were in the same cycle, almost the same cycle, because we are interconnected. So when the American economy is booming, everybody's booming. When it's in a recession, and then global recession will come. So you see fluctuations in Latin America. I mean, the thing I want to ask you is, how do people really see America as? Do they see it as a land of opportunity for them to get higher paying jobs? Do they really want to immigrate to America? Can a local economy of respective Latin American countries, are they vibrant enough to provide enough opportunities and upward social mobility for young people, especially? If that's the case, then probably they can stay. If that's not the case, then they will have to go to America, and then supply and demand. And America will eventually face the problem of so-called immigration.
Of course. And what you're stating is basically the conflict from like the center and the global south. Just in the American continent, you have the way the model is being played at the moment, with the US hegemonizing the whole of the commercial power, at least in relationship with this hemisphere, with its imperialistic relationship with this Latin American and Caribbean region. This puts the region in that predicament every time. The only horizon is to triumph in their own logic, then that only aspiration, that logic in itself imposes migration. And it's not only happening between the US and Latin America. You could say that similar things, although these comparisons always need a lot of, but similar things happen between Europe and Africa, for example. So these flows of migration that are rejected by the central powers, but at the same time imposed by the own logics that they are like constituting in the region. So of course, like, could the region itself, could Latin America be good enough on its own? Could it be vibrant enough for its own population, its own desires, its own wishes? Well, definitely there are a lot of experts saying that if regional integration could take place, if a lot of the demands and needs could be met through cooperation between these countries that are very rich. For example, it's one of the areas with the highest amount of natural resources. That's why it's such a disputed area at this moment. So if all of those resources, human-wise and natural resources, could go to those own states and its own development, then probably yes. But the world state at this moment is imposing this constant flow of dependency. And that is exactly what central powers are generating. So basically, that is a great dispute. And that is something of what is playing along. And it's always like a great internal contradiction. You're generating that problem that then you are rejecting as you're coming to invade our country. It's not, no one's coming to invade the country. It's just how the flows of migration and the capital itself is dictating that people need to move.
Very frequent talk point of Trump is that there's this globalist capitalist class outsourcing jobs to developing world, and so Trump claims that he wants to end that. Do Latin American people really think that he's going to end that, and how does they see the so-called economic nationalism? Do they see the American economic nationalism as benefiting the Latin America or not benefiting Latin America?
I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind in that sense is that when Trump says America first, and of course any Latin American and or Central American or Caribbean citizen will say, first of all, we're all Americans, and that's why we say US in any case. But when Trump says America first, that in the same movement, he will need higher pressure and higher discipline on Latin America. To make that America first move, they need more pressure on what they consider to be their backyard. So that move of America first means more discipline, more pressure, higher sanctions, for example, like more different measures to emphasize and to enforce that dominance on that region, because you need that region to work only for you. So basically, all analysts were signaling at that first period of Trump, he wasn't dealing as frequently with Latin America. It wasn't as much in his discourses. He didn't even pay one official visit to any state in the region. He just participated at one of the America summits. But aside from that, he didn't visit officially any country. The first visit of the US Secretary of State when they came to power, this case, was to the Panama Canal to unleash all that question. And then I'll ask you about that. But to unleash all this thing about the Panama Canal and denouncing China's intervention or China's role there. So basically, the first thing they do is go to a very significant and important key spot of the Latin American region and say, we're here and we're here to claim our dominance over this territory. And also, it's Marco Rubio doing this. The whole nomination of Marco Rubio, a son of Cubans who has done his whole political career basically enforcing the idea that US needs to dominate over this region and that any form of alternative government, such as Cuba, for example, or Venezuela, basically cannot exist. That is the person they're nominating to handle the whole international agenda. So basically, that is playing a role, definitely. But I wanted to ask you, how are you seeing it from over there? How are these topics playing? Because I understand that, of course, from China not having, it has a completely different relationship with the US, a relationship that does not have to do with that dependency, even geographically dependency, but a completely different way of engaging with the country, with this nation. So how are citizens perceiving this new Trump administration?
I think For civilizational states like China, we have an inherent logic to look at um, cultures from outside and figures from outside. When you look at the founding of the United States, you have a bunch of religious fundamentalists, the Puritans, who see themselves as persecuted by the Anglican Church and the English Crown. They flew to America, established a so-called kingdom of heaven on earth. So there's a very strong religious conviction over there. When they transform the religious conviction into liberal democracy, and then you later on, as America's comprehensive national power grew, America became increasingly assertive, and there's this bunch of guys who are really Trotskyist, but they abandoned the socialist faith or the communist faith, and they started to develop this new conservatism. And these people, they're called new cons, but what do they want to conserve? They want to conserve liberalism. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, they want to, they are like a messianic tradition. They want to convert people through political violence or really military violence. So they want to fight wars to convert people into exactly liberal democracies like America. And that is where Chinese people have a very big issue against. So we're sort of like isolationist Chinese people, because if you look at the geography of China, you look at to the north it's a desert, to the west it's Himalayas, and to the south it's dense jungle, to the east is sea. So we have already reached our geographic boundary. So the Chinese nation is self-contained. So we don't want to go out and invade people. We see that cost severely outweighs the benefits, the potential benefits. So we don't want to do that. But then if you look at an outsider, a Western civilization, the people who claim that their political model, their philosophy is somehow superior to yours, and they want to convert you to their belief system, and you have a very big issue with that. So the Chinese people, they generally have an issue with liberalism, especially the neocon variant, where they want to lecture everybody how to run your government. We have an issue with that. But then, since the reform and opening up till probably 2010s, in that 30, 40 years period, because China started from a very humble position, China's comprehensive national strength wasn't really up there. Our economy wasn't better than an average African country. So the Chinese people look at America, they look at the West and Europe, they see, okay, so their system performed so well. They are like so ahead of us. Probably there's something we should learn from them. So some people sort of did this converting their faith to the liberal idea, the capitalist idea. So they think, okay, America, their system is inherently better than the Chinese traditional system or the socialist communist system. So it's their belief. But as China grows, as its comprehensive national power in science, technology, military, education, you name it, economic, of course, as it grows, then Chinese people become more confident. They start to see, okay, so we're not so bad after all. We can beat them in our own game. We can do good. Then they started to reflect upon the previous generation's lack of confidence. Then they see they really have a problem with what they call the West. When Trump himself had a problem with so-called deep state, globalist idea, the so-called liberal international order, he is not a fan of that. Trump is not a ideological person. He's not a dogmatic person. He has an art of deal. He's transactional. Then he calls him a pragmatist. That's the Chinese people familiarity with this kind of guy. If he's a Machiavellian, then so be it. If he wants to self-benefit, so be it. We're not against that ideologically. We're not against that in our values. So You can take some win, we can take some win, so we can coexist. That's basically how Chinese people really see Trump. But the thing is, um, it's getting interesting nowadays. Like I mentioned, the two things came into office. One is secure border, remake America, and two is also to remake America, but from an external point of view, to retreat, basically, to retreat from the overexpanded global empire into, you mentioned taking Greenland and Panama Canal and what they say, Canada to be the first 51st state, which is to consolidate regional power in America, North America, and probably South America as well. So his project, I think, from what I personally read of Trump, is that he abandons this global empire project in favor of a militarist, sometimes fascist, potentially fascist state. But that state is retreating from the world, but expanding or consolidating regionally in Latin America, in North America, especially North America. And I think that's probably the inherent danger for Latin America region. That's just my reading. I don't know whether you agree.
Definitely, they're betting on a shift of some kind without losing that world power. So again, it is a bit contradicting how they will handle, or how even Trump in his own discourse is trying to say, okay, America first, but let us still order the whole world at the same time. So it's definitely interesting what you were saying of how, from a perspective from China, that could be resonating with other moments in history and what that meant. What I was wondering is definitely the perceptions and the way that the US, and particularly Trump, is antagonizing with the Latino community, and in terms of migration, in terms of the entire region, has like one way of being. But China is present in their discourse as well, as a very antagonizing power, and that shapes a big portion of what they do, what they say, how they present themselves, what decision they make. I was mentioning before the question with the Panama Canal, and how they were coming to Latin America, but they were coming here to present a dispute with China. So how is that being perceived?
You hear Marco Rubio and Trump saying, "Okay, we're in a multipolar world." What they mean is that America, whole America, probably North America, South America, is one pole, is his pole, their pole, and
Their poll.
with their pole, yes. And you see great powers like, I won't name who, but there are other great powers viewing their regions as their pole. Okay, but to the Chinese people who are self-contained and isolationist people, okay, we have our pole. we are happy with ourselves. But if you come to us, if you want to fight a war in our doorsteps, so be it. I mean, there are many war games simulated by the Pentagon, like dozens of war games they simulated over the Taiwan Strait, and most of the cases they lost. Well, maybe that's the way for the Pentagon to ask for more military budget. We don't know, but the Chinese people, they are confident in that sense. They are more familiar with the kind of worldview rather than this hardened regional hegemonic view, rather than that kind of soft, liberal market economy, that kind of very soft manipulating globalist empire. In China, there is a saying like 辩经. You have to go to the scripts of biblical scriptures to debate with them. So that's a dogmatic belief. That's a debate over dogmatic belief. And China, we don't have that tradition. We suck at debates. And but when you see a great power that creeps to your door and wants to carve up a part of you, only when we are weak we are afraid. in Qing dynasty, yeah, the Chinese central government was really afraid of the Western powers like Britain and France and America and Japan and Russia. So there was this time. But nowadays, I mean, Chinese people see it as virtually impossible for the America to really severely damage the national interest of China. So we are okay with that. Healthy competition between nations. So long as it's healthy.
Now, precisely pointing at, you were saying like we're at a good point to compete, right? You were even mentioning something like there are areas in which you're on par with the US and probably even going beyond some technological developments. And I gather from what you were saying that this sort of leaks into the popular sentiment of confidence at a moment in time like right now. How does that play with what you were mentioning before of some parts of the population having sort of like the Western aspiration, looking at the West and sort of having, is that still going on? Is that simultaneous? Do you see this happening at different sectors of society, or is this from another time? How does that happen like in the same moment?
That's a very good question. Because we had a global empire, we endured a global empire, and a global empire, like I mentioned, is a soft empire. It rules through economy, it rules through higher education, it rules through indoctrination of belief systems. So of course, there's this older generation of Chinese. When the national power of China wasn't strong enough, they look up to everything the West embodies and what the West tell them what it means to be Western, what is the Western value. So they look up to those values, and those very people are right now in very important positions of many significant institutions. So these people, those values emanated from those institutions closely resembled Western values. And this younger generation of Chinese who are more confident, assertive, whatever, they are not in positions of power, but they are growing increasingly loud, especially on the internet. And these people are, so it's sort of like a generational, I wouldn't say generational conflict, okay? So there's this element of generational conflict in China. I believe it's the same in many countries. In the US too, when you have the millennials and Gen Z versus
Mm-hmm.
the boomers, the boomer generation, there's this value conflict as well. So that's been playing out most of the industrialized world, and China is no exception to that.
So, how would you say that younger sector, that sector that's grown in a more confident or more powerful China, how are they looking at Trump? Because I just putting in some perspective here in Latin America, most of this new right wing sectors that are fueling from that return to traditionalism are in many cases the younger generations. And that has to do with an inability, because of course we're coming from very, very different geopolitically regions, inability of the region of presenting a powerful horizon for that generation because external conditions and everything. So that younger generations are the ones in many cases looking at this Trump followers and going to having a reactionary movement back to conservatism and back and against any progressive wins in terms of rights that have happened in the region. And this is very much linked to harder economic years. So that young generation is thriving on that hardship and is fueling that new right wing sectors. Of course, there are also leftist young generations. Of course, you have more vibrant nations with a very strong popular movement and ongoing left revolutions that have their own dynamic. But in some sectors where the right has thrived, that young generation has been fueling that increase, that growth. So how does that young generation in China that grew up with this more powerful China, how are they looking at Trump?
When you look at Chinese social media, you see some accounts copying content from the right wing talking points. You see the right wing podcasters talking to Chinese audience, and those accounts are really some of them are masked as English language learning channels, and people go to these channels and listen to those right wing talks. People love those talks. And if you look at progressive, okay, what they call more woke or DEI stuff.
Of course, we could have a whole episode on those terms as well.
Okay, yeah. And people just don't like those stuff. And that, I think, has got to do with, like you mentioned, industrial society and the emancipation of women into the workforce, and that creates anxiety. And of course, this capitalism is actually sucking out air space from young generation, the young men who can't afford to live like their daddy's generation. That problem is especially evident in the U.S., not so evident in China because China has been rising so fast during the last generation. But China is actually, the young people are experiencing this economic squeeze. So when they experience that squeeze, they also will look to other sources to confirm their identity. So they look to traditional sources, they look to conservative sources to basically to pat on their shoulder and say, okay, you're doing great, you're a man, keep on doing what you're doing, and girls will like you, and people love that. Who wouldn't love that? But I think there's this very subtle difference between China and probably elsewhere in the world, is that those people in many countries, they look up to Trump. They see, okay, so MAGA movement is actually saving America, and probably a MAGA movement will spill over to my region, my country, and this conservative government will save us. So we'll be great again. So make whatever great again. But
Right.
in China, although okay, we say make the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is make China great again, and even going back to the fall of the Qing Empire, it's also make China great again, make China China again. So China has always been great. So the Chinese people are really proud people. They take extreme pride in their own identity. So make China great again is like when Sun Zhongshan said 驱除鞑虏,恢复中华 is actually make China China again. So make China China again in itself is to make China great again. So China has this tremendous pride in ourselves. And when China's national power grows, China's so confident, this young generation is so confident that they don't see Trump as a role model they should imitate or we should look up to Trump. No. That Trump is one of us. Trump is actually following us. So they see the playbook of the US economic nationalists. They say, okay, you want to copy the Chinese industrial policy. You want to copy this playbook from China, and you're increasingly like China. So China, in some areas, is actually our government system is actually ahead of you. The US wants to be like China, basically, to compete with other great powers. So that's why the Chinese people, especially the younger generation, they look at Trump, they laugh at him, but not in a bad way. They laugh at him and they like him, almost like a clownish person, but also a relatable person. So they have many nicknames for Trump. They say that he wears this red tie, right? The very long red tie. They say it's a red scarf for the young pioneers of the Communist Party. So they look at Trump like he's one of us, not an outsider that we should emulate. So it's not a shiny city upon a hill, not anymore. So in that sense, yeah, the younger generation is like that in China.
What do you think is the sentiment going forward? Like, what expectations are there? Does it change the perspective from what could happen in terms of how can the US affect the coming years in terms of how will directly affect China's citizens? Is there a question regarding that? Because, of course, in Latin America, that's a permanent question. But is there a question regarding it? Are there assumptions in that regard?
Yes, from where I come from, I see myself as a socialist. I see myself as from the left. So, of course, I'm very uneasy with the way Trump reimagines America. Not only Trump, but his allies, especially his high-tech allies, um, where you have this new reactionary group of people who wants to get rid of the masses, get rid of people, only to preserve the capitalism itself, probably AI dictated capitalism. So it's only to preserve the brain, get rid of the body, and that seems very dangerous to me because socialism is all about the body, right? It's all about equality, people, right? It's the people deciding how the economy should run, and that is what I see the greatest danger of Trump and his allies, this new reactionary right. And I think China is not paying enough attention to that area because a lot of Chinese people, especially young people, they look up to figures like Elon Musk. They look up to figures like Peter Thiel. When they read of stuff of Curtis Yarvin, they say, "Okay, it's Machiavellian. It's totally about concentrating power." When they read about that, they're okay with that. And I think that's the danger lies because when the society is run by algorithm, society is run by monopolistic tech or monopolistic capital, I think that is the great danger. And our only hope is that the Chinese state, where the political power resides, will guard against those dangers and protect our citizens from those dangers. But I think we need to really talk about this more often on Chinese media.
It is, and it is also interesting to compare and contrast because we are looking at the same thing, but from not only far apart in terms geographically, but from different positions politically, and how that affects that person, that young man looking at that algorithm, that family that hopes to have like a better future for their children, and where will that better future come from, and how is that being conditioned by this broader, wider things. So the possibility of exchanging those perspectives gives us, I think, a little bit more light on what we're doing and what we are seeing closer to us.
Yes, it's very interesting. We should continue this conversation sometime in the future. Definitely going to be very enriching for both of us, both our sides, both our audiences.
Definitely will do. It's been such a pleasure, Kris. It's been a great conversation. And of course, we're here to continue talking.
Yeah, yeah. I see you next time.
See you next time.